Awesome. Well, thanks again, guys, for all being here. My name is Thorne. I'm going to be running through the South African Rand today. Previously, I was looking at the New Zealand dollar and the Australian dollar, and I still have a few more coming up as well. So if you're interested in Sweden, Norway, or Poland, you can definitely be sure to check these out, happening a bit later. But essentially what we're doing today, as well as just kind of reviewing some of the broader aspects of the South African Rand, I think it's almost an opportunity for us to kind of take stock of where we are now, because we will look at sort of things historically, where South Africa is now, and potentially where South Africa could actually go, because it is a remarkably troubled and turbulent economy. It has seen some very difficult socioeconomic moments throughout its history, and we're not out of trouble yet, I think, as far as things go. So there's definitely a bit of work to be done, and we'll kind of just review the general state of things. So I was actually born in South Africa as well. I left when I was 6 years old with my family. We moved to New Zealand in the hope of finding better opportunities. And I think it was a good move. I have actually only been to South Africa once since we left, so it was actually quite refreshing to do the research for this presentation, because it kind of pulled me back into that space and it brought me a little bit up to speed with where things are, because I don't actually keep very close communication with a lot of my family who are still there. But yes, nevertheless, the South African Rand. Let's dive into it. So South Africa is the 26th most populated country in the world at 56.9 million people. And as you can see here, it's just right at the bottom of the African continent. And so migration to South Africa actually began in the second half of the 17th century, when the Dutch East India Company settled in the Cape to establish a supply port for traveling ships. So from the Netherlands, you would have boats basically coming all the way around. They would need to close this loop, and then on their way back up to India, there was a little stop over here. So a little bit later down the track, the British actually rolled in as well to set up a similar sort of supply port. And what's interesting about South Africa as well is you can kind of see the tug of war between these two different colonizing countries as well, because some of the even towns and the jurisdictions have English names, and others sort of have these quasi sort of Dutch names. And of course, the Afrikaans language, which is one of the key languages there spoken amongst the white South African population, definitely is like a daughter language of Dutch as well. Apparently, it's pretty comical to the Dutch when they actually hear it. So the capital city, or cities rather, should be said, as there's actually 3 capital cities. They've got an executive capital, a legislative capital, and a judicial capital. And they all sort of serve different purposes. I'm not entirely sure why they decide to partition these 3 things up, but nevertheless they did. And then briefly looking at the map here as well, you'll see, let me try and hide this. You'll basically see what I was sort of talking about with regards to names as well. So you've got like Kimberley, you've got Pretoria, Worcester, which are all sort of these British names, and then you've got other things going on here, like Bloemfontein, which carry more of a sort of Dutch aspect to it as well. So official languages: English, Afrikaans, Tonga, Ndebele, Swazi, Tswana, Venda, and Xhosa and Zulu. I cannot even speak a little bit of Afrikaans. I left when I was perhaps too young, and my parents never really felt it important to teach me, but nevertheless, it is what it is. And so with ethnic groups, we can see that the majority of South Africa is in fact still Black African at 80.9%, colored 8.8, and then the white population, very much a minority at 7.8 as well. And the majority of, there's a majority of Christian at 86%, and then the rest kind of take a very small percentage. But it was interesting as well, because during colonization, even as the Christian religion was brought in, there were many different sort of factions of Christianity that have since sort of broken away from, I guess, the main umbrella. And even going from sort of town to town, there's definitely very different takes on Christianity as well. There's a very troubled history of the South African Rand. So it was actually interesting to do the research for this because I was very surprised to see that the South African Rand is actually a relatively new country, and since its introduction in 1961, it has basically followed a path of sort of debasement and inflation after the first few years of actually kicking off. So there was a little bit of stability, and then things just got completely out of hand. So I'm not too sure as to what the socioeconomic factors behind that actually are, or maybe they're like socio-political factors, or maybe it's just terrible management or lack of understanding around monetary policy. I'm not too sure, but as said here, the Rand saw a fairly auspicious beginning, trading at a rate of $1.4 to 1 Rand. So this is actually a very strong peg to start off with as far as things go, because the US dollar was performing quite well at that point in time as well. And the US dollar only became stronger than the South African currency for the first time in 1982. So by about this point, I think this is when we start to see extreme inflation starting to take place with the South African Rand. And by the early 1980s, high inflation and mounting political pressure combined with sanctions placed against the country due to international opposition to the apartheid system had started to dramatically erode the Rand's value. So for those that don't know, South Africa was actually the place that sort of pioneered this apartheid system to such an extent where there was extremely disturbing separation between the Black and the white population. And of course, at this point in history, like during the 80s and the 90s, most of the world, at least overtly, had moved away from such sort of rules and segregation, but South Africa, for whatever reason, just kind of continued. And I think to this day, that's still a bit of a, well, not even a little bit, it's a definite stain on South Africa's history, but I think the aftershocks and the ripple effects of this are still felt within a lot of the younger and older population of South Africa, and that racial tension definitely does still exist. So by the time the state president, P.W. Botha, made his Rubicon speech on the 15th of August, 1985, the Rand had weakened to 2.4 per dollar, and 4 years later had dropped to 2.55 per dollar. So this is basically like it halving in value in the space of about 5 years, which is already not so good as far as things go. And a host of local international events influenced by currency for the next 3 decades with poor monetary policy and social instability, the Rand reached an all-time low of 17.9, so almost 18 Rand per US dollar on the 9th of January, 2016. So this has to be one of the most radical and also one of the fastest monetary debasements, I think, of almost any economy. Even looking at places like Turkey, which I was just checking out John's presentation before, did not actually get to this level of inflation. So this is truly insane. And as of 2020, the US dollar to South African Rand exchange rate is approximately 15 Rand to 1 US dollar. So still made a small recovery from its all-time low, but still absolutely terrible. High rates of poverty, crime, political unrest, and unemployment continue to plague the country and the value of its currency. So to me, a place like South Africa would actually make an extremely good use case for adoption of cryptocurrencies and deflationary assets, things like stable tokens. I think there's a lot to be gained. So much of the population really has no alternative. And what we'll also see a little bit later on is so much of the population is actually unbanked. So there's definitely some huge benefit to be had from people being able to access apps that allow them to very easily transfer tokens from crypto around. So South Africa is an upper middle income economy, one of only 8 countries in Africa. So it definitely has an abundant supply of natural resources, well-developed financial, legal, communications, energy, and transport sectors, and a stock exchange that is Africa's largest and among the top 20 in the world. So this probably speaks to a lot of the exports that take place in South Africa. There's a lot of diamonds, there's a lot of gold, platinum. Again, we'll look a little bit closer at this very soon. However, the economic growth has decelerated in recent years, slowing to an estimated 0.7% in 2019. So that's growth of GDP, just by the way. Unemployment, poverty, and inequality are still amongst the highest in the world and remain a definite challenge. So the economy of South Africa, second largest in Africa. We can see here, basically, if you look at the legend, all of the bluer countries are the more established, higher GDP countries. So the gross domestic product of South Africa is 730 billion US dollars. So considering that the population of South Africa, we were getting close to about 60 million, and then the population of Australia is 25 million. Australia's got a 1.2 trillion US dollar GDP. So it definitely speaks to a lot of the inequalities that we saw earlier, and a lot of the population of Africa are not really working or able to contribute towards the gross domestic product of the country, just due to the inequality, lack of education. Yeah, there's definitely a lot that needs to be worked out. We can see basically here a little breakdown, composition by sector of origin. So very strong in the services here, 67.5%. I do believe this is actually one of the highest in the world in terms of what it is actually adding to the GDP. And then industry and agriculture, not so much anymore. It used to be a little bit higher back in the day. So economic snapshot, I thought this was just actually a really cool graph to kind of see how the different aspects of the economy actually all relate to one another. And so this graph essentially shows a snapshot of the country's economy in comparison to other economies. So for example, South Africa's export rank is higher than 78.49%. The countries in the data set for exports, for FDI and GDP measures, a higher rank closer to 100%, indicates a stronger economy. Conversely, for unemployment and inflation, a lower rank closer to the zero indicates a stronger economy. So we're seeing here that we have got a very high ranking in terms of this inflation arm. We've got a fairly low GDP per capita, and we've got a remarkably, I might even say disturbingly high unemployment rate here with regards to the other countries in the data set as well. So I think there's a huge amount of improvement, and there's a necessity for this improvement to happen fast as well, because South Africa is definitely suffering. So in truth, because of the disparity between the upper and lower classes, and it is a very drastic disparity, South Africa is basically not considered a first world or a third world country. Essentially, it actually qualifies as both. Because if you are in the top percentile, you are very well off. And also it's a very cheap place to live if you are very wealthy. And so South Africa's rich whites make up 17% of the population and account for 70% of the wealth, which is ridiculous. And those figures make it an exact microcosm of the world at large. Very poignant indeed. So financial services. South Africa has a sophisticated financial structure, with the JSE Limited, the largest stock exchange on the African continent, ranking 17th in the world in terms of global market capitalization, which is about $1 trillion as of August 2020. So the banking industry overseen by the South African Reserve Bank is dominated by 4 local players. That's Nedbank, ABSA, Standard Bank, and First Rand. These banks provide both retail and investment banking services, as the sector has become highly competitive with the re-entry of experienced foreign banks. The banks operating in South Africa, when left short of liquidity, need to borrow from the SARB at a fluctuating repo rate, which in turn allows the central bank to monitor liquidity position. I think this mechanism definitely needs reviewing, because obviously it's not working very well, and they're having an extreme problem with inflation. So I'm not sure exactly what aspects need to be addressed, but I think so far as the South African Reserve Bank goes, there's definitely a lot of work to be done. And so what I also mentioned earlier here that I found was really interesting. So you can see basically the distribution of market share across the top banks in South Africa. But here, we actually have 32% of the country that does not actually have a bank account. And I'm sure this statistic will be mirrored in a lot of other third world countries as well, as most of the poorer people just transact in cash. But this is a very great opportunity, I think, for there to be fast and wide adoption for very simple applications on the phone or on web browsers that basically allow people to transact value using crypto tokens or stable coins. So South Africa's formal employing SME, which is small to medium enterprise segment of the economy, is much, much smaller than originally thought. Collectively, there are only some 250,000 formal employing micro, small, and medium enterprises in South Africa. So if you compare that to a population of nearly 60 million, that's not a very entrepreneurial landscape at all. And I think this just basically speaks again to the inequality and the difficulty to actually raise funds and capital and to try and fail. And so a lot of the buffer that is given in first world countries with decent loans and also interest rates that aren't too high basically cannot be made use of in countries or in South Africa. So the majority, 50% of 56% of jobs in South Africa came from only 1,000 larger employees, including the government. And these jobs are growing faster at a faster rate than what the SMEs are creating. So there is this centralization of the workforce across a small distribution of companies, which is typically what happens in struggling economies as well, because I guess what's actually brought the economy there is a lot of private interest, lobbying government, making favorable laws, and then ultimately we kind of get into this cycle where things start to centralize and privatize a lot more. But interestingly as well, the government actually is involved. They are actually big shareholders in a lot of the big companies that do operate in South Africa as well. So the top 15 companies in South Africa, although the natural resource extraction industry remains one of the largest in the country, with an annual contribution to the GDP of 13.5 billion, the economy of South Africa has diversified since the end of apartheid, particularly towards services. So you can see here the top 15 companies: Anglo-American, basically metals. We've got Sasol, chemicals, Shoprite Holdings, food and retail, telecommunications, banking, et cetera. But in comparison to other companies of similar industry in first world countries, the revenue generated here is actually, again, rather low. Oh, here's Germany. Oopsie. Let's move that back. My apologies. So South Africa's export economy. The main export goods: gold, diamonds, wine, iron ore, platinum, non-ferrous metals, electronics, machinery, manufactured equipment, et cetera. I think we've all seen movies like Blood Diamond, and a lot of those stories are actually true, and again speak to the use of cheap labor to actually extract a lot of these resources as well, which is a pervasive problem throughout Africa as a whole. I think this might even be touched on later, but South Africa is in fact the largest gold, or has the largest gold deposits in the world as well. So I'm sure that as far as things go, there's going to be continued mining and resource extraction there. Main export partners, we have China, United States, Germany, Botswana, Namibia, and India. China again taking the lion's share here, which is what I've also seen happen in New Zealand and also Australia. So China definitely is very intensive on the resource importing. And so total exports for South Africa in 2019 were at 108 billion. Oh, not again. So this is again where we get to see the concerning elements of what's actually happening with the wider economy of South Africa, and then also here you can see how that actually relates to the global trend of government debt, which, yeah, I guess, look, we had this pandemic basically kick off 2019, 2020, and we can just see everything start to skyrocket here. So we're definitely headed towards a very interesting and potentially concerning time as well. It's yeah, all I can say is it's just going to be a very, very interesting time. So the fourth industrial revolution and digitization can transform South Africa and Africa as a whole into a global powerhouse. And so this speaks again to what we can actually see, or what I sort of believe is going to happen, in that it's the third world countries which really have the most to gain from adopting technologies like Bitcoin, like blockchain, and certain deflationary assets, because traditional monetary policy in places like these has been extremely poor. But I don't think it's all due to faults of their own. I believe there's been a lot of international intervention from first world countries to basically try and prop up and manipulate and even control to a certain extent a lot of these third world economies, which I guess probably serve private interest for the most part. But yeah, essentially, it's just a very, very complicated problem. And we haven't previously actually had the opportunity or the technology to pivot to other systems until very recently with the introduction of things like Bitcoin. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time. And this fourth industrial revolution, as mentioned here, is really characterized by the fusion of the digital, the biological, and the physical world. And there's a lot of people now talking about this. And I think this phrase, the fourth industrial revolution, is a bit of a hot topic at this point in time. So it remains to be seen if these are actually used and implemented in an egalitarian way or a totalitarian way, because both are possible. And I'm sure maybe some of you have heard about this concept of technocracy, which I think is very closely tied with the fourth industrial revolution as well. But it's kind of like technological communism to a certain extent. So I think if we don't really watch what's going on, it is possible to use all of this amazing technology that has been created, like blockchain, in the wrong way. You know, you can have closed blockchains, you can have private blockchains, which are still very opaque, and ultimately defeat the purpose of what blockchain really offers. It kind of doesn't really capitalize on the full feature set. So similarly as well, the growing utilization of new technologies such as artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, 3D printing, and the Internet of Things, and advanced wireless technologies, among others, has ushered in a new era of economic disruption with uncertain socioeconomic consequences for Africa. So it's probably quite obvious, but most of Africa, being in a sort of third world dilemma, hasn't had a lot of access to technologies. And a lot of the different industrial revolutions that have actually taken place. And I was reading an interesting book the other day, which was basically talking about how the order in which countries received certain technology, I guess you could say, strongly influenced how those technologies actually came to determine the economy and the country as a whole. So for the countries that actually entered or got agricultural improvements before they got military improvements or before they got transportation improvements, they all experienced very different outcomes. And so I think this is going to be a very big issue for Africa because they've got such a growing population that are struggling to be fed. So giving them all sorts of new technology doesn't really solve problems, which they're still trying to get sorted. So far, it does not appear that South Africa has yet claimed the 21st century. It still lags behind in several indicators for essential for a successful digital revolution. See across here. Let me just make this out of the way. But artificial intelligence, AI, and blockchain are attracting interest in Africa as they have the potential to successfully address social and economic challenges there. Again, I think it has to be implemented in a very, very careful and thoughtful way, so it doesn't actually cause too much disruption, because there's definitely a very big learning curve that needs to take place. But yes, it's going to be a very, very interesting time. An estimated 15% of South Africans have invested in Bitcoin, the second highest percentage in the world, according to the Global Web Index, beating even the US and Japan. So this statistic might need to be fact-checked a little bit because I was just watching Christian's presentation, and I believe that he was actually saying there was another country who was in second place, but nevertheless, it's still very high up there. And I think if you consider that over 1.2 million users in South Africa had around the same number of clients as South African Twitter users were using crypto, it's also the fifth most popular finance app on the iPhone, third on Android, ahead of most of Africa's biggest banks, says the exchange. So we've got a lot of the population who are unbanked, but then we have a lot of these citizens who do in fact have investments in crypto or do have accounts with crypto exchanges, which is really, really cool and extremely promising as well. And we've seen a similar trend take place in Turkey, again, which is a country having very severe problems with debasement and inflation. And there's just kind of this natural tendency of citizens to go to where stability exists and where opportunity exists. So I think these countries, South Africa definitely can play a very, very big role in actually paving the way towards wider crypto adoption, because they just have so much to gain. You know, it's not like someone sitting in New Zealand or Australia or first world countries in Europe, where for the most part they experience a stable economy. You know, people are really fighting tooth and nail, they're living hand to mouth, and it's just, there's just so much more to gain from actually adopting something new. So regulation and attitude towards cryptocurrency in South Africa. While regulation generally tends to lag behind innovation, regulators in South Africa have shown a great willingness to engage with the community and work towards pragmatic regulation. South Africa is officially embracing cryptocurrency trade and investment laws with its financial and capital markets, and regulators predicting an increase in crypto activity. This makes a departure from much of the rest of Africa. And in many other countries, central banks are directing commercial banks to avoid processing transactions involving trade in crypto assets. So that's a very promising start. At least there is some sort of freedom to trade as they please. Digital or daily crypto asset trading values in South Africa were exceeding 145 million for the first time in January 2021, which is absolutely awesome. And I think this is only going to increase. We're kind of seeing this exponential adoption curve now. And I am just going to kind of burn through these because I've only got 2 minutes left. Sorry, I've kind of been chatting on too long. But yeah, in conclusion, South Africa is an emerging market ready for adoption of digital technologies. Unfortunately, South Africa is still experiencing great disparity in standards of living. However, cryptocurrencies are beginning to gain attention as a good hedge against continued debasement of the rand. And so, yes, the unit platform is going to be offering a unit token called the ZARU. Please excuse this saying NZDU. And so the ZARU is a decentralized stable token issued by units. And the important difference here that separates it from things like USDT is that instead of being backed by fiat, the collateralization is happening with crypto assets, things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Polkadot, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to dive a little bit more into the actual specifics of these stable tokens at another point. It sort of goes beyond the scope of this project. But yeah, for the sake of everyone's time, and if there is maybe one quick question, I will just get right to the very end and just say thank you very much for tuning in, guys. And I'll be following up with some other presentations next. I think we've got the Poland or the Polish zloty. But yeah, thank you all.